My name is Mick Napier, and I want to welcome you all to another weekly broadcast on behalf of the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, where we aim to interview people who can make a significant contribution to our understanding of what's going on, the better to attempt to change it. I'm very pleased this week to be able to welcome Shir Hever. Shir is an Israeli economist, and it's been a pleasure for Scottish PSC to host Shir in the flesh, as it were, visiting Scotland and speaking to meetings in various cities. But today he's speaking from Germany. Shir, are you still based in Germany?
Yes, in Heidelberg.
You used to work out of the Alternative Information Service in Jerusalem, who do fantastic work. You were a part of a team there. Why did you decide to leave?
Oh, well, mostly for personal reasons. I guess at some point when you see almost all of your friends being interrogated by the secret police one after the other, I knew I have to make a decision whether I want to go to jail as part of my activism and commitment to the cause, or continue to do this from outside. And I chose the easy way, I have to say. I have a good life.
Okay, well, anyway, once again, welcome. Let's start off with the article you wrote, which is widely cited, about the ultimate destination of aid headed to, which is supposed to reach the Palestinian people in one way or another. You've come up with an astonishing figure of 78% that is redirected, confiscated, in some way ends up not where it should be, but with the Israeli authorities. Now, there's a lot of people out there, Shir, who just look at anything on the internet that shows Israel in a bad light. If somebody writes up that Israel invented Ebola, then it'll be picked up by some foolish people. That's an astonishing figure. Can you justify that?
Yeah, well, it's funny that you're bringing this up, because last week has been a very intense week when it comes to the question of the responsibility of donor states to the aid money that they're investing. In fact, back in October, there were 2 classrooms which were donated by the European Union and confiscated by the Israeli military because they didn't have a building permit, as almost no Palestinian structure, whether donated or built by Palestinians, can receive a construction permit. So last week, the Israeli civil administration, which is a misnomer, it's the military government of the West Bank, decided to sell those classrooms in an auction for profit. And the response to that in the media was quite severe. There were some articles in various media channels, including The Guardian, and the Israeli authorities decided to postpone selling those classrooms because they realize it looks very bad for them when they steal something that was donated by the EU and then sell it for profit. The problem is that there are many projects which are donated by the EU, by the United States, by Japan, Canada, Australia, and many other countries, where there's very little accountability to the donor states about what is being done with their money. And I think here the onus is not on the Israeli authorities, but rather on the donor states. So when you say that people like to see Israel as the devil, there is an old Jewish expression that it's not the mouse is not the thief, but rather the hole in the wall is the thief. In a way, when the donors create no accountability for the Israeli government, then why shouldn't the Israeli government make use of the aid for its own economic benefit? So getting now to your question, how do I justify getting to that figure of about 72%? I mean, there are different ways to calculate this, of aid that ends up in the Israeli economy. So what I did was create a simple statistical correlation between the trade imbalance which exists between the Israeli economy and the Palestinian economy and the amount of aid that is giving every year. And that means that if a certain a year would see $1 billion in aid more or less, then the impact on the trade imbalance between the Israeli economy and the Palestinian economy is very highly correlated, very highly correlated. Out of every dollar, then 72 cents on average would end up in the Israeli economy. But just to be clear, this is not to be confused with profit. The fact that Palestinians are forced to use the aid money to import items through the Israeli ports and through Israeli companies, doesn't mean that if they import an item that, let's say, has a value of $100, then the Israeli company has a profit of $100. What they have is a revenue. But out of that money, they have to, of course, pay for the product itself, which is often, in about 80% of the cases, is in fact imported from a third country. So just to be clear what this money signifies, it signifies that in the end, this money flows out of the Palestinian economy and doesn't really stay there to create new jobs and new infrastructure and so on.
Well, when you say 70-something%, I saw the figure of 78 widely quoted. 72 is still enormous. What are the mechanisms? What are some of the mechanisms whereby the aid does not reach its target, or a portion of it reaches its target, but much of it is creamed off? Someone talked about aid being delivered in Israeli vehicles to the various checkpoints on the border with Gaza, that they can be held up, large fees can be charged, and so on and so on. Can you give us some of the more egregious examples of how this works?
The vehicle is part of it. If a Palestinian transportation company wants to deliver goods to the Israeli market, to sell some product to Israelis, they're not allowed to do that. Not even if they're from the West Bank. They will have to transfer all the goods to an Israeli transportation company in order to reach the Israeli market. But if an Israeli company, they want to sell to the West Bank, their truck can go all the way into the Palestinian cities and into the supermarkets. There is no problem, and they can sell their products directly. That gives them an immense advantage. But that's not the whole story, of course. All of the border crossings, if we're talking about imported goods, and that includes not just food and medicine and construction materials, but it also includes fuel and the most basic components for allowing the economy to run. These things also have to go through Israeli border controls, either the border control with Jordan or with Egypt, or through the seaports or through the airports. Everything is controlled by Israel. So that means that the Israelis will collect the customs, will collect the taxes, will collect all the handling fees and storage fees, and then they will transfer those goods to the Palestinian cities and villages. But and they do have an obligation to transfer the customs to the Palestinian Authority for those goods which are eventually intended for the Palestinian territory. But they take a handling fee from that amount, and also they only give that money if they receive receipts. And if Palestinian merchants fail to produce all of the receipts for the goods that they have imported, then the Palestinian Authority gets the short end of the stick, and they don't get all of the money that's due to them. And one last point that I think is very important to make is the issue of the currency. Because Palestinians do not have their own currency. They have to use Israeli currency. And that might seem to be a technical issue, but in fact, it is a major economic significance when the Israeli central bank can print Israeli shekels and can control what economists call the seigniorage. Seigniorage is how the government can benefit from small amounts of inflation by printing a little bit of money, but the cost of inflation is distributed to everyone, but the government still gets a profit from that. And Palestinians cannot do that. Palestinians cannot have their own monetary policy when the money is controlled by Israel. So what it actually means is that all of the goods and services which are provided by the donor countries, the donor states and organizations to Palestinians are in fact a form of export for the Israeli economy, because the Israeli companies provide these goods and services, and the money comes in foreign currency and is converted into Israeli currency, into shekels. And that is what economists call export.
Did I see somewhere, there's so many horrible scandals emerging from Israel-Palestine, one forgets. But I think I saw a couple of years ago, after Protective Edge, that the US was insisting that Israeli companies be allowed to participate in the rebuilding of Gaza. Does that ring any bell with you, Shir? Was that?
Well, this is a very intense debate. And I think it's not just the US, but there's a fierce discussion between workers of the United Nations and especially UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, because UNRWA is an organization where most of their employees are actually Palestinians. And of course, they are loath to see Israeli companies profiting from the suffering of Palestinian refugees. That's, I think, quite clear. But on the other hand, they're obligated, according to the charter of UNRWA and the charter of the UN, that they have to find the cheapest and most efficient means to provide the service. So that means that for rebuilding houses in Gaza, one of the most important things is cement. And the cement, which comes from the Israeli side, is manufactured and owned by a monopoly called Neshel, which is about 50% of it is owned by the Israeli government. So it's a largely state-owned monopoly, which can dictate the price of cement. And nevertheless, the price is going to be cheaper than any international company that can export cement to Gaza, just because cement is extremely expensive to transport. It's a very heavy material for a very low value per ton. So that means that UNRWA has to choose. Are they going to buy the cement from Neshel and thereby allowing an Israeli company and even the Israeli government to profit from the destruction of the homes that the Israeli military has bombarded itself? Or are they going to pay an exorbitant amount of money to try to buy this cement from a third country and bring it over through the Israeli ports and through Israeli transportation companies and through the Israeli storage facilities and so on? So the Israeli companies are still going to make a profit from that. And also by doing that, violate the charter of the UN, because they're not really allowed to do that. And they will be able to build much fewer homes this way, because the budget will go for a much smaller amount of cement. So this is a real dilemma. I don't think that's just an issue of the US putting pressure or the Israeli government putting pressure. I think it's a structural problem.
So people in a prison don't have a lot of choices when it comes to how to organize their internal affairs. Shir, I heard you speak about your latest book, The Privatization of Israeli Security. The title didn't help me, but when I heard you speak, I think I understood the basic thesis, that you're talking about a crisis inside the Israeli security elite. You introduced, you described the whole situation of do-it-yourself killings of Palestinians, as opposed to the disciplined approach of the Israeli military. Can you tell viewers, what's the basic thesis of your book?
Well, I think I'm assuming that a lot of the viewers who are watching us right now are people who have watched previous conversations that you've held, and they have some understanding of the occupation and some of the opinions and ideas about it. The reason that I wrote this book is because I think there is a problem with how many Palestinian scholars and also some Israeli scholars and international scholars are covering the story of the occupation. And I'm talking about people who I hold in the highest regards, the cutting edge scholars of Palestinian politics and the economy and geography. They tend to focus on the issue of how divided and disempowered Palestinian society is. And they're correct, of course, but I think we have to look at the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that it doesn't matter how divided and how weak the Palestinians are. It only matters how divided and weak are they in comparison to the Israelis. Because after all, we're doing very political research here. And I think falling in love with the side of the victim is dangerous if it makes you keep that person or that side or the Palestinians as perpetual victims, as eternal victims. You have to create research that has a liberating element into it, that has the ability to show people a way to break through the cage. And here, I think, is the reason that I wrote this book. I wrote it in order to show that the Israeli mechanism, the apparatus of control, is cracking. There is a lot of weakness there. And despite, people often say that Israel has the strongest military in the Middle East. That's not true. or one of the strongest militaries in the world, the fourth strongest military in the world. That's absolutely not true. In fact, what you have is a military that is built on a lot of hype. And it's the same thing with Mossad. You know, a lot of, I'm sure you know this from your colleagues, that a lot of people on the left tend to develop a certain amount of paranoia regarding the Mossad, that, you know, maybe the Mossad is listening to us, maybe they're everywhere, they could assassinate anyone they want, and so on. That is the image that the Mossad itself is trying to create. You know, we have to see, are they correct in trying to get everybody to be afraid of them? What will happen if people will put a needle in that balloon? And I think that is actually what we are experiencing now, that you see major Israeli generals and commanders of the Mossad. We've seen that now in the elections in Israel very clearly, that these people who always like to speak with an assertive voice and with a lot of self-confidence are actually confused, and they have no plan for the future. And they have no technology and no weapon that can stop Palestinian resistance. And they realize that. And that's why Palestinian resistance is becoming so powerful. I think Palestinians in Gaza, despite living in a cage, they have a very clear understanding of Israeli society and of the limitations of Israeli society. And that's how they're winning this kind of arms race with the Israeli military. The Israeli military still has the best rockets and missiles and tanks and airplanes, and the Palestinians have kites and balloons. But these kites and balloons are humiliating the Israeli military.
So your analysis leads to the idea that there's a core weakness. Despite a lot of power vis-a-vis the Palestinians, there's this core weakness. And how do you see this core weakness? I think I remember you speaking in Scotland, you were talking about the much greater effectiveness and ferocity of organized military disciplined killing compared to these people who kill Palestinians at random on the ground, burn families to death, and so on. Right. I think you were saying there's a loss of control, that there's some sort of bizarre, or a certain species of racism on the part of Arab Jews inside Israel, who are quite rightly not part of the European elite, and who see that they're being denied the right to be violent towards Palestinians. Did I get that completely wrong?
I mean, there are a lot of different aspects there, and you're putting it all in one place, and maybe that's a bit difficult to parse. But let me try to focus on one issue, which is the chain of events that led to the very strange situation now in Israel, where there's going to be another election. And I think this is not very often discussed, but the reason that the Israelis are not able to have a stable government, and that Netanyahu is not able to form a coalition, is because of Palestinian resistance. And that's not something that you can read in most newspapers. And the reason for that is that Lieberman, the former Minister of Defense, he now took revenge against Netanyahu. He says, I will accept no prime minister except Netanyahu, but I will still not vote against his coalition. And he's doing that because it's pure punishment, it's pure revenge for Netanyahu humiliating him in November last year. If you remember, November 2018, this was after a year of the Great March of Return, or most of the year. It started in March 30th. And the Israeli government responded by saying, we are going to invade Gaza again. There's going to be another invasion of Gaza, just like in 2008-9 and 2012, 2014.
But they didn't do it, yeah?
And they didn't do it. But Lieberman wanted to do it. And Lieberman waited for Netanyahu in November to go to Paris, because there was a ceremony 100 years for the First World War. And when Netanyahu was away, Lieberman sent a group of spies, of Israeli agents, into the heart of Khan Yunis, which is deep in Gaza. And they were exposed. And there was a shooting spree, and some Palestinians were killed, and 2 Israeli soldiers were killed. And then Lieberman said, he organized a press conference, and he said, well, now we are going to invade Gaza. I'm giving the order right now. I'm the Minister of Defense. We're invading now. Not one unit moved, not one battalion, not one platoon. And Lieberman was humiliated, and he resigned in anger. The reason that nobody moved is because Netanyahu has foreseen Lieberman's actions and have arranged with all the generals that nobody does anything without clearing it with him first. Why was Netanyahu so afraid that Lieberman will invade Gaza? I mean, Netanyahu himself said he wants to invade Gaza. He said it many times, but he knew that if the Israeli soldiers are going to march into the Gaza Strip, there will be a complete collapse of discipline. The soldiers will not obey orders. There is now a movement on social media of hundreds of Israeli soldiers saying, my officer told me that I have to use a non-lethal weapon to put down Palestinian demonstrators instead of shooting them with my normal deadly rifle. I have decided to refuse that order. And if I have to use a non-lethal gun, I'm not going to go to that demonstration at all. I'm just going to refuse the order. A lot of soldiers are saying that. And they know that they can say that without being punished because the officers are afraid of a major riot and they don't want to punish any of the soldiers. So you have a refusnik movement from the right. It's a strange phenomenon. It's not what many people would like to see. I would also like to see a refusnik movement from the left of soldiers who say that for moral reasons they will not take Palestinian innocent lives. What we see is soldiers who say we will not obey orders that forbid us from taking innocent Palestinian lives. And because of that situation, the military loses its structure and it becomes an angry mob. That's what Netanyahu is afraid of. If that happens, the soldiers are not going to move according to their structure. There's going to be a lot of innocent civilians being killed in the first couple of days of that invasion. But then there's going to be an international uproar and the Israeli army will have no choice but to put some soldiers on trial. And in the end, that's not going to be a very effective operation. I mean, I'm sorry for being very cynical about this. I'm trying to convey the Israeli perspective on this, which doesn't really care about Palestinian lives, but cares about the effectiveness.
But you're saying, sorry, have I got you right? The Israelis do calculate the effect on public opinion. The BDS movement goes up by steps following each massacre. There's a calculation, of course. There's no humanitarian element that is discernible. But are you saying that while the snipers are killing demonstrators on the Great March of Return, which seems to suggest no controls at all, it actually is controlled. But in the event of a ground invasion, then the controls would disappear and the army could melt down. A lack of discipline could lead to completely unforeseeable consequences. Is that the scenario that
Well, I think what we're seeing with the snipers is already the beginning of a loss of control. Absolutely, because there was a lot of mystery. If you remember, from the very beginning of the March of Return, there were very severe injuries where Palestinian doctors in Gaza didn't know what was going on. They didn't know what kind of ammunition is used that causes these very severe injuries to protesters. Until one Israeli soldier from Breaking the Silence, the organization that gives testimonies about military operations in the Palestinian territory, one soldier explained exactly what is happening. What is happening is that every sniper is armed with two different rifles. They have one rifle which is intended to cause non-lethal injuries at short range when the demonstrators approach the fence. And they have orders to use that weapon only when Palestinians come near the fence. But they also have a sniper rifle which is intended for a very long range and it is very deadly. And the soldiers are told, use this rifle only as a last result. Or use it if you detect somebody that the military wants to take out in a distance. That's also a possibility. But what the snipers actually do is they take that lethal rifle and use it at short range against Palestinians who come near the fence and kill them. And that's why you see these pictures, these horrible pictures of Palestinians being shot in the head, children being sniped in the head. And it's not because the Israeli snipers can't hit the target. It's not a mistake. It's a disobeying of orders. And there were some very interesting interviews with Israeli officers about what's going on in Gaza. One of them was completely transcribed and translated by Electronic Intifada, so you could even have this whole conversation, see this whole conversation on the Israeli radio with an Israeli general. And they're asking him, how come you killed a 12-year-old boy near the fence? did the sniper just act on their own volition? And the general cannot admit to that. The general says, the general cannot say that the snipers miss the target. But when faced with the other interpretation that maybe the sniper decided to disobey order and murder a child, then the general realizes that he cannot say that without putting that sniper on trial. And then he says, well, a child is a small target, so it's easy to miss. And you can hear how he changes his story in the middle of the conversation when he realizes that the consequences of him telling the truth would be devastating. And I think that's really how it works. And I think the people who understand this perfectly well are Palestinians in Gaza. They know what's going on. And they knew that by having this Great March of Return demonstrations, even if hundreds of people were killed by the Israeli snipers, it is still less disastrous than if the Israeli government would feel that they are in control of the military and would invade Gaza like they did in 2014 and kill thousands instead of hundreds.
So despite the horror, we have to deal in the real world in degrees of horror. It's a lesser horror than Protective Edge or Cast Lead, and it also highlights this weakness inside the chain of command, inside the Israeli army. Is that breakdown between all the officers pretty much as a whole? Is it a horizontal split and the sort of much more violently inclined soldiers, or does it also appear as a division inside the officer class between different sections at the same rank?
Yeah, well, in my book, I talk about this group that I call the security elite. And the security elite is a very homogenic group. And this is a group of the most senior officers, usually, which are almost all of them are men. Almost all of them are Ashkenazi men. That means their families originated from Europe or North America. And almost all of them are secular, or at least I would say they don't show their religious beliefs. They don't wear a kippah, for example. So that is a very small, tight group. And they also tend to promote people who are like them. So that's why it's very difficult for Jews, Mizrahi Jews, who originate from Arab countries or Muslim countries, to join that group. And it's very difficult for women, and it's very difficult for religious men to join that group. But nevertheless, there are a few. One of them is Ofer Winter. He's a division commander, who during the 2014 invasion of Gaza reinterpreted the orders that he received from the military, and he said, instead of our task, which is to apprehend Hamas leaders and to find weapon caches and that sort of thing, our task is to take vengeance against those who blaspheme against the name of our God. And he said that the speech to his own soldiers and caused panic in the Israeli security elite. Because, you know, when you have an officer who decides that he's going to reinterpret this as a religious war and ignore strategic objectives and instead just go after whoever he wants. And what he did actually, he took reporters with him in the unit and showed them how he's bombing every mosque that comes across his path as he takes his soldiers deeper into Gaza. Every mosque on his way was bombed, to show that this is a religious war from his perspective.
Mosques even more than a strategic building or whatever, yeah?
Yeah, that's the point. But of course, because of that, then Ofer Winter was immediately put in a way that he would get a desk job and will not be allowed to advance within the military, because the military brass were very afraid of him. So they decided they're going to make him into a kind of advisor to the government. But the chief of command of the Israeli army refused to have him in a position where he would be a senior advisor to the government. And so Netanyahu, who is a populist and wants to promote that part of the military and show that he's aggressive and he also supports the idea of a religious war, he wanted Ofer Winter to be his own military advisor. And the commander of the army, Gadi Eisenkot, is supposed to give 3 names, and then Netanyahu can choose one of them. So Eisenkot gave him 3 names that don't include Ofer Winter. And then Netanyahu said, well, none of these 3 is good for me. And Eisenkot gave him another 3 names. And they played this for months and going to low-rank officers and so on, until eventually Lieberman became Minister of Defense. And then Lieberman said, well, I will take him as my advisor. And then that's where Ofer Winter found his next assignment. But then Lieberman didn't stay Minister of Defense for very long. So I think it shows to you how these internal intrigue, this conflict within the officer class, shows these very clear ideological divisions. If you talk to the commanders of the security elite, those people who are very secure in their position as the commanders of the security elite, they keep saying Israel should ease the siege on Gaza. We have to be rational. We have to give Palestinians something that they will have something to lose, so that they will not be too enraged. And their fishing zone, for example, that's something that the army keeps insisting on, that Palestinians have a few more nautical miles where they can fish, and they'll have a bit more food, and they'll have a few more jobs, and that will keep things calm for a little longer. And this kind of language is just no longer acceptable in Israeli society, because Israelis perceive that as a humiliation. Why should we care how much food Palestinians have? Why should we care if Palestinians have a job or not? And because of that, the security elite is losing its power, losing its influence, and just lost the election. So
can I just ask one final question before we move on to matters much more economics? Would you see the reason for this change, if you like, a certain kind of fragility? I mean, an army needs to be a disciplined organization where people obey orders without question. The army that smashed Arab nationalism in '67 and which reversed an initial defeat in '73 against the Egyptians, do you see these changes inside the army as just an almost natural progression in a settler colonial project, which doesn't stand still? It doesn't, it has to develop, and the Palestinians continue to resist, and that causes fissures inside the army? Or is it a sociological change inside Israeli society that's pushing more and more religious Jews, who in the past were relatively insignificant, into more and more influence inside the army and in the units that are prepared to go and fight and do violence to the Palestinians rather than enjoy the flesh pots of Tel Aviv, as is often put?
Yeah.
Do you think it's sociological or just political?
I don't think you can separate the two. I think both of these armies, if we look at the army of '67, which was a very effective and powerful army, and if we look at the army today, which is a very ineffective army, both of them are colonial armies. But the difference is that these are 2 generations of settler colonialism. In the early generations of settler colonialism, there's a very strong collectivist identity. People say we are part of a nation. The colonial project is our project. We have ownership of it. And that means we have to make sacrifices. And if people are willing to make sacrifices, then they can form a very powerful military and a very powerful collective entity. In the War of '67, there were a lot of Israeli casualties, but it was almost socially forbidden to mourn them, to stop and mourn the people who fell in battle, because it was more important to celebrate the triumph and the victory. And many of the officers who died in the war were very important to the, managing the small units and the tactics on the ground. But then reservists who were low-rank soldiers who didn't have any officer training just stepped up and became effective officers and took control of their own units because they felt that somebody has to do it. Somebody needs to do it. And another thing is that if you look at the army in 1967, a lot of the Israeli soldiers, even the ones who came from Europe, they bothered to take the time and learn Arabic, because for them, learning Arabic is part of the tools that you need in order to assert control of the territory. Now let's move to the army today. Today we have a situation where soldiers are insisting on receiving good conditions by the military. If the food is not good enough, they're not going to show up for training. Now you have soldiers who don't bother to learn Arabic because that's the language that they consider to be less important, a primitive language. You know, they disrespect it, so they don't bother learning it. Doing really intelligence work, which means you have to get inside the head of the enemy, is something that they don't want to do, because why would they get inside the head of somebody they have no respect for? And because of that, the next generation of colonialists, they don't see themselves as part of the collective. They see themselves as the inheritors of this project, which now belongs to them. And now they should get to reap the benefits. They don't want to make any more sacrifices. That's what their parents and grandparents did. And I think that's the big difference. And if you have soldiers who are not willing to make sacrifices, then the army is not going to be able to face any dangers. There's a brilliant Israeli scholar, Yagil Levy from Beersheba University, and he did this kind of graph where you see all of the wars that the Israeli army engaged in since '48 and until today. And all of these wars, the number of casualties as a proportion of the population steeply goes down one after the other. You know, the direction is very clear. The chance of an Israeli soldier to die in a war is smaller and smaller. But then he compares it with the public response to casualties. And this is going in exactly the opposite direction. Because if in 2014, 76 Israeli soldiers were killed, that number becomes unbearable and unacceptable. And that was considered to be a humiliation for the Israeli army, something that the soldiers, the officers were considered to be lax at their job because they didn't protect the soldiers well enough. 76 were killed. Compare that to the War of '48, in which 2% of the entire population was killed. That's almost unfathomable. 2% of the whole population was killed. Not even in the worst invasions of Gaza did the Israeli forces kill 2% of the population. And nevertheless, after the War of '48, if people were expressing sadness in public, that was taboo. You had to celebrate and dance in the streets because we won. And, you know, so that shows the sociological and political difference, which is unmistakable.
Absolutely fantastically significant. Share your thoughts then on Netanyahu's saber rattling for a war against Iran. It often quickly becomes America should attack Iran, but you know, he's threatening Iran that Israel may attack it. What are your thoughts on that, Shir?
Yeah, you know, in 2012.
In the light of what you've just said, yeah?
Right. Yeah, 2012, Netanyahu went to the United Nations. Obama was then president of the US, and Obama was speaking about signing a deal with Iran, the nuclear deal. And Netanyahu spoke at the UN and said, if the world will not help us, we will attack Iran on our own, and soon. And then a couple of my Iranian friends called me up and said, Shir, should we be worried? What's going to happen with our families back in Iran? Like, what's going to happen? And I said, well, now that Netanyahu said this, you can relax, because Netanyahu never said a word of truth in his life. So, you know, that's the sign that things are going to be okay. I still think the chance that Israel is going to launch an attack against Iran, I mean a significant attack, not some kind of intelligence operation or assassination, but a real attempt to blow up one of the nuclear facilities, for example. I think that's very unlikely. What is unfortunately likely is that the United States will do something, because it's very clear. I mean, the fact that Trump appointed Bolton to be his strategic advisor, when Bolton is a, you know, one trick dog, as they say. He can only say that the US should attack Iran. He doesn't have any other opinions. So why did Trump appoint him then? Obviously, he's planning something. That's very concerning. And I think this is exactly how Netanyahu wants it also. Netanyahu wants the US to increase pressure on Iran, maybe even to invade, maybe even have a terrible war. But he knows very well that the Israeli army is not willing to make any sacrifices in such a conflict. Iran, unlike Gaza is much more capable of protecting itself. They have a lot of, they have a strong military, they have anti-aircraft technology, and they have military bases in Syria, which is very embarrassing for the Israeli government, which said, under no circumstances will we allow Iran ever to have a military base in Syria close to Israel. And when Iran did build this military base, then Netanyahu said, well, I'm going to speak with Putin about this. And he did speak to Putin just before the election, and Putin found a corpse of an Israeli soldier that was found in Syria and sent it to Israel for proper burial. And Netanyahu made a big deal out of that in order to win the election, to show that Putin is his friend. But you have to understand, this was instead of removing the military base, right? So this tells you what are the priorities. Symbolic steps like bringing back the dead body of a soldier, yes, but actual changing on the geopolitical deployment of armies in the Middle East, no.
Sure, I've been dragged off my initial aim because of what you've just been saying. But let me, before we get cut off by Facebook, who don't compromise, can I just strongly recommend this book, in which Shir develops a lot of these arguments. But I also want to recommend this earlier book, The Political Economy of Israel's Occupation. In it, you argue that the occupation of the areas conquered in '67 is a substantial financial burden to Israel. Now, I'm reading, does it not counter that to say that the Palestinians are a huge captive market and that Israel can destroy productive capacity and sell to these Palestinians? A Palestinian who was just recently released from prison, lives in Scotland, he says that in the prison system, they're kind of fed very, very poor food indeed. It's rubbish. But they can get decent food if their families contribute money to the pay for it. Now, it seems that, there's opportunities for making money. Just to finish off the question, I visited many years ago the big refugee camp in Nablus, and people showed me how a pile of rubble in the road was able to smash the dairy industry in a nearby village. So wheel traffic became impossible, and then the people in the big camp had to buy Israeli milk, which was everywhere. But you're arguing that it's an economic burden for the Israelis, and therefore, all other things being equal, pressure might lead them to withdraw?
Yeah, well, these are two different things. Everything you said is correct. There is a destruction of the Palestinian productive capacity. That's something that's absolutely proven and documented from the very first days of occupation. The fact that Palestinians are a captive market to Israeli companies, absolutely correct. And you've given the example of the prisons. And in fact, this is the research that I've done for the Palestinian organization Adamir, which is for Palestinian prisoners' rights, that after the Israeli prison systems, only the prisons where political prisoners, Palestinian political prisoners are held, what in Israel they call the security prisoners. They've privatized the canteens. So Palestinians have to buy from a private company, and the private company is making a lot of profit for selling food that would cost a fraction of that amount if prisoners would be able to buy it outside in the free market. And so, yes, that is also correct. And in my book, I try to create a calculation to put this against the other. In fact, what I found in the book, that if you look at all of the security costs that accompany the colonization of the West Bank and previously of the Gaza Strip, if you look at the cost of the wall of separation, if you look at the cost of the surveillance system, and if you also look at the cost of the prison system, because yes, prisoners do spend their own money or their family's money in order to survive in prison, but still the cost of imprisoning them is not covered by that. You have to compare these amounts, and yes, the economic burden of the occupation has turned the occupation into the biggest economic project in the history of the state of Israel. It's in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's affecting all of the Israeli public services, health, education, transportation. There's a crisis in all of these public services because government money constantly flows to keep the colonization project working and to keep Palestinians under control and under surveillance and in jails and so on. But then you ended your question by saying, oh, so that will make the Israelis withdraw. No. That's a different issue. The fact that it's a heavy burden on the Israelis is correct. But I don't think that Israelis make a decision whether to occupy or not occupy the territory based on a rational calculation. That's not how it works. If that is how it would work, then the occupation would have ended with the first Intifada already in the 80s. No, so the Israelis gain something from the occupation, which is not measured in money, but measured in prestige, measured in power. Because even the poorest unemployed Israeli has more freedom of movement and can travel and be respected and not treated as an enemy wherever they go, unlike a Palestinian, even if that Palestinian happened to be a successful business person, you know? So that poor Israeli has something that the Palestinian does not. And that inequality in prestige, in freedom of movement, in what I call cultural capital. It's not I call it that, it's a term from Pierre Bourdieu, this French sociologist, but it's something that can explain why people make choices that don't seem to make a rational economic sense, but they do make sense. And I think what is going to end the occupation, and I do believe the occupation will end, I am very optimistic, is not when the occupation will become too expensive for the Israelis to bear, but rather when the Palestinians will be able to focus their protest in such an effective way that the Israelis will feel that even the prestige that they gain is not worth it anymore. Let me give you one quick example of that. Benny Gantz, who is now the head of the opposition in Israel, used to be the commander of the Israeli military during the invasion of Gaza of 2014. After that invasion, he finished his term as commander of the army, and he gave a quick interview. And he said in that interview that he feels ashamed when he travels around the world to admit that he's Israeli, and that he thinks this is a problem because the world is judging Israelis for what they do in Gaza.
I saw figures that a large number of young Israelis, when they travel abroad, have a very similar attitude. Yeah. Yes.
But Benny Gantz was the commander of the army, and now he heads the second largest political party in Israel. This particular interview with him was largely forgotten, and it's not brought up so much in the media anymore, even though Netanyahu could have used it maybe to attack him. But I think Netanyahu also doesn't want to get into that particular line of argument. So I think this is very interesting when he says that, because it shows that Palestinians are able to attack the Israelis where it hurts, and it hurts where they have their colonial pride of being masters of the land. And if the world community is looking at Israelis and say, well, we don't think that being the masters of the land is necessarily a good thing. We're not particularly impressed by your acts of dominance over the native population of the country, then the Israelis are losing their ability to have effective political, to put effective political pressure on Palestinians.
A couple more questions, Shir, if I may.
Are these the Facebook questions or?
Facebook questions, yeah.
Okay.
Israel refuses to meaningfully negotiate with the Palestinians. They have this overwhelming power advantage. And indeed, I think you write, as well as others, about always looking for a technological solution to political problems. In Glasgow city centre at the moment, there is an Israeli military-grade surveillance system purchased from NICE Systems. There's quite a scandal at the moment, by the way, about facial recognition. San Francisco has banned it. In Glasgow, they have emotional recognition software, Israeli. Given that Israel uses technology to avoid a political negotiation with the Israelis, to stave it off further and further, what would your message be to people like the Scottish government and other governments who who claim to be pro-Palestinian, but allow Israeli technology to benefit from sales on our markets. In terms of what I've just said, would you have any message to Scottish?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that the Israeli government doesn't want to negotiate with Palestinians. They do want to negotiate. They want to always negotiate and negotiate, but never make any compromise.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I mean.
Negotiation is ideal for the Israeli government because then all international pressure is put on hold. You know, we're just going to reach an agreement and very soon. So just to make that point clear. But regarding the surveillance technology, facial recognition, and this whole security sector, Tel Aviv is considered the world capital of the homeland security sector, because a lot of Israeli companies are marketing their expertise in controlling the Palestinian civilian population. I think intelligent customers, whether these are corporations or cities or states, would know that all of this technology of surveillance, what the experts call the SIGINT, signal intelligence, where you have an algorithm that automatically makes decisions instead of a human being, whether, for example, by for example, trying to recognize faces and comparing them to a database of faces, or what you describe as an emotional detector. All these automated systems that replace human security and instead use signal intelligence, that's something that's not working because it doesn't stop the Palestinian resistance by 1 second. So if you look at the Israeli exports in that field to the world, they're actually going down year by year because more and more of the customers realize that they're making a mistake of investing so much money in something that has no effect. But I do think that right-wing governments and right-wing parties that want to imitate a system of apartheid in their own countries, for example, because they're Islamophobic and they want Muslims to be afraid to walk out in public space, or they hate Arabs, or they hate refugees and migrants, and they say, let's use the Israeli system of racial profiling. Let's use the Israeli system of giving people rights based on their ethnicity, based on their nationality, based on their religion, and therefore create ranks within a society. But it's very difficult to do that in a democracy. So what you do is you start importing the technology and implementing it in order to legitimize this idea that people are under constant surveillance and control. And if it so happens by mistake, you know, that the people who get arrested most frequently happen to have darker skin or wear religious garb that is associated with Islam, then nobody's to blame because it's a decision of the machine. You know, it was an algorithm that made that decision, and I think that makes it easier for right-wing governments and right-wing parties to push their racist agenda forward. And I think that's why the biggest supporters of the state of Israel and its policies in the world are the most far-right racist governments that we have today in the world, like Bolsonaro in Brazil or Viktor Orban in Hungary. These are, and they're major supporters of Israeli policy openly, and also Narendra Modi in India. And what they do is also buy these technologies of surveillance and implement them and show that's how we do things. You know, and Duterte from the Philippines was recently visiting Israel. He visited Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, because every foreign politician has to visit Yad Vashem when they first visit Israel on an official visit. But Duterte said in a press conference about 2 years ago that he wants to be like Hitler, because Hitler murdered 3 million Jews. That's Duterte's words. Of course, that's not correct. There were many more. But I want to murder 3 million drug dealers or and in that sense, I am like Hitler. And this was a terrible statement by Duterte. And when he was in Yad Vashem, Israeli journalists asked him, how can you defend what you said about Hitler? And his answer to the Israeli journalist was, I buy a lot of weapons from Israel. You know,
He
I
said
buy a
this
lot of weapons, so leave me alone.
He said this inside the institution, the
Yes.
building, the walls, yeah?
Yeah, yeah. In a press conference that he had, where often you have the situation where you have these leaders visiting Yad Vashem and then giving a quick a statement about their impressions, and that's when he was asked. Bolsonaro, by the way, he was also just visited Yad Vashem about a week before the elections in Israel, and then in that statement where he spoke after visiting the museum, he said, "Well, you can see that the Nazis were leftists." You know, that was his takeout from visiting Yad Vashem. Of course, that created a major outcry as well.
So Duterte may be a thug, but he knows the rules, and he explained the rules publicly. That's his big mistake. Shir Hever, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure. It's not exactly the way I wanted the conversation to go, but it was extremely valuable, and I think the analysis that you put forward should guide people active in Palestine solidarity. So many reasons to despair, but we have to find some reasons for optimism. Shir Hever, thanks very much.
Thank you, Mick.
And we hope to see you sometime over here when you write your next book.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Shir. Bye-bye. Bye. Guys, we may have a couple of minutes. We may have a little bit more, but I would like to develop, just to build on something I mentioned to Shir. The story of facial recognition, actually, it's called automatic facial recognition. I'm not against facial recognition to put something on my door when I come home, you know, modern technology, but sweeping crowds at football games and political demonstrations and walking down the street and shopping, apparently. That's automatic facial recognition. And Shir couldn't seem to, I'm not sure if he understood precisely what I was saying. Nice systems, they say that what they have sold to Glasgow City Council is emotional recognition software. So it's getting out into the mainstream. People are beginning to feel very uneasy indeed, or that unease is becoming public. I do want, please put in your diary for the 29th of June, Saturday, 12 noon in Glasgow, in front of the city chambers, demonstrate protest against this automatic facial recognition. Scottish PSC has been banging away at this for many years. We think we've played a very positive role in this. The Glasgow City Council press office responded to one journalist who inquired about the campaign against this facial recognition software by saying, "Oh yeah, you mean the anti-Semites." So we've been accused of being anti-Semitic for campaigning against software, cameras, Police Scotland use of intrusive technology without our permission and taking our information to use in ways that nobody knows. Friends, thanks very much. I hope you'll agree. Shir's talk was absolutely scintillating. Valuable insights we gained from it. Next week, we're delighted to have Nahla Abdul, who has written Captive Revolution. It's a book about women's role in the struggle in Palestine, specifically inside the Israeli prison system. You may remember that poet Dareen Tatour was under house arrest or jailed for years for writing a poem and posting it on Facebook. We hope to learn more from Nahla Abdul. These books are available from Scottish PSC at very cut price rates. We do deals with publishers and we don't make a penny profit by and large. So Shir Hever's books, Nahla Abdul's books, Jeff Halper's book last week that we talked about, War Against the People, all of them are available. Just post us. You can get in touch if you want to, and we'll get a copy to you for 10 quid for every single book. No, 10 quid for each book. Okay, thanks again. Thanks for joining us. Next Sunday, 4 p.m, Nahla Abdul for another incredibly valuable conversation with somebody who has something to contribute to your understanding of the struggle for Palestinian liberation. Thanks again. See you next week.